Well, first of all, thanks very much to Alok and Google for making this event happen, particularly given the circumstances. In preparation for the Sloan conference, I've myself been practicing my elbow bumps, although I must admit that as a Brit, I find resisting the urge to shake hands with people to be quite challenging. So the goal of this project is to use tracking and event data to quantify and analyze team strategy. That is the set of instructions that a manager gives their team, both as a group and as individuals. The first step in this work was to consider team formations. And so what I'm going to do is present a data-driven method for measuring and classifying team formations, analyzing their offensive and defensive configuration separately, and dynamically detecting changes in formation over the course of a match. So, in soccer, the choice of formation is one of the most important team tactical decisions in a match. It determines player-specific roles, how those players interact, and influences the playing style of both teams. So on the left-hand side of the slide, I believe is the first ever record of formations in a match. It shows the lineups for the first official international game in soccer between Scotland and England in 1872. So England started the match in an ambitious 1-2-7 formation, which means they played with one defender, two midfielders, and seven forwards, whereas Scotland played with a bit more of a cautious 2-2-6. And miraculously, this game ended 0-0. Of course, tactics have evolved over the last 150 years, and sadly, no team plays with seven forwards anymore. But descriptions of team formations are still largely reliant on the number of defenders, number of midfielders, number of forwards, nomenclature, which are really quite crude summaries of player configurations that are a lot more fluid and nuanced and dependent on specific circumstances. So here's a quote from the Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp. You need to create a formation for defending where everybody knows what to do. And for offensive things, you need to find a formation where they really are in their best area of the field. And we can do that in different ways, obviously. So clearly what Jurgen is saying is that they have different formations for different situations in the game. So that maybe at the crudest level when they're defending and attacking, and probably in more fine detail than that. So there were kind of four objectives to this project. The first is simply to use tracking data to measure team formations in and out of possession, so defending and attacking separately, making multiple observations per match. We then went on to identify the unique set of formations used by teams in a large sample of tracking data, and use this unique set of formations to dynamically classify observations in a much larger sample, such that we could study transitions between defense and attack, and tactical changes during matches. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bits of work that we're doing now to investigate the connection between formations and playing style and chance creation and the speed with which teams can transition between different types of formation. So in this plot, I've plotted the positions of the outfield players of the defending team playing from bottom to top. At four different instances of time. So it's just the outfield players and the defending team that are plotted. It's real tracking data. And so what you can see first is that teams tend to occupy only a fraction of the playing surface at any given moment. But the outfield players tend to move as a coherent block, maintaining their formation as they move around the field. So the insight here really is simply just that formations are not defined by the positions of each player on the pitch in an absolute sense. They're defined by their positions relative to one another. So we measure formations simply by calculating the vectors between every pair of players and averaging these vectors over many frames. So for example, at this instant here, I've indicated the vectors between player 6 and player 8, 17 at 5 at a given instant. Here's the vectors between the same set of four players at some later instant of time. And of course, then we can, over some period of time, calculate the average vector between every single pair of players to essentially measure a lattice, which represents our observation of the team formation. What I'm going to do from here on in is I'm always going to present formations such that the center of mass of the formation is aligned with the center of the field. So you'll notice that I said averaged over some period of time. What did I mean by that? So in soccer, possession is exchanged very rapidly during a match. So the median length of a possession in a game is typically around 5 seconds. So in order to identify offensive and defensive formations throughout a match, where we aggregate together consecutive periods of possession of the ball for each team into 2-minute windows, and then measure the formations of the team that were in possession and their opponents within that window. So this chart here essentially just kind of shows you an example of that process. It shows the first 15 minutes of a match with match time along the x-axis. And then the red bars indicate the time in which the red team are in possession of the ball, and the blue bars indicate the periods in which the blue team are in possession of the ball. And so we piece together all the red bars until we have 2 minutes, measure the formations of either team, do that again. And in our latest version, it's more of a rolling, rather than non-overlapping windows, we have a more of a rolling process. But when you use non-overlapping windows, this produces an average of 10 defensive and 10 offensive formation observations for each team per match. And it turns out that 2 minutes of in-play data is sufficient to produce realistic, accurate-looking formation observations. And so here's an example of all the formations measured for a single team during a game. On the left-hand side, you see their formations measured when they were out of possession of the ball, so when they were defending. And sort of here on out, these are always going to be plotted such that the team is attacking from right to left. And on the right-hand side, you see their formations when they were in possession of the ball, so when they were attacking. So there's a couple of obvious things you can see. That when they were defending, they played with what you would typically call a 4-1-4-1 formation. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but 4 defenders, 1 holding midfielder, 4 sort of midfielders in front of that, and a single forward. Whereas when they're in possession of the ball, the outside defenders or the fullbacks would push forward into midfield. The outside midfielders would push forward to form a front 3. And there was in this case, a bit of asymmetry in terms of where the 2 attacking midfielders, either side of the defensive midfielders, would play. And it's also pretty clear that the defending formation is considerably more compact, much smaller convex hull than the attacking formation. But really, the take-home point from this slide is that there's no evidence for any change of formation in this game. All the formation observations are completely consistent with one another. So I've described a simple methodology for measuring formations in 2-minute aggregated possession windows. In the next section, I'll use agglomerative hierarchical clustering to identify the unique set of formations used by teams over a large training sample of matches. And then in the final section of this talk, we'll apply this classification system, this unique set, to a much larger sample of matches such that we can classify any new formation observation and then use this to analyze how teams change formation either through transitions or major tactical changes. So our training set consisted of 100 matches of tracking data, from which we obtained nearly 4,000 formation observations. So that's approximately 2,000 of teams defending and 2,000 of teams attacking. And of course, the goal here is to group together similar formation observations such that we can identify the sort of unique formation types in this training set. But in order to do that, we need a metric for assessing the similarity of formations, such that we group them. So, for example, how similar can we quantify how similar the formation on the left is to the one on the center to the one on the right? And you'll notice that these blue ellipses have now appeared because we simultaneously measure not only the average position of each player or each role in a formation, but also how far the players tend to deviate from that position. So we quantify the similarity of formations using the Vosstein distance. So in the simple case of just two bivariate normal distributions, each with their own mean and covariance matrix. The Bostine distance between these two distributions would be given by the expression in this white square. In the trivial case in which we're just looking at point particles, the covariance matrices disappear and you're just left with the L2 norm of the distance between the two means. Obviously, there's X and Y coordinates here. In practice, each formation observation consists of a set of 10 bivariate normal distributions. So really the task here is to try to understand how do we pair one player or one role in one formation to the other, such as to minimize the sum of the Bostine distances between the two formations. So we really treat this whole thing as an optimization problem. Essentially, what is the minimum cost of moving from one formation to another? So this is basically solving the linear sum assignment problem, which we do with the Kuhn-Munkres algorithm. So one small extension that's worth mentioning to this process is to recognize that two formations can be identical, but one might be a more compact instance of the other. And given that we want to separate formations based on their shape and not solely the area encompassed, we rescale one of the formations during a comparison such that compactness is no longer a discriminator. So we do this by introducing a variable scaling factor k that essentially expands or contracts the formation around its center of mass, and we search for the value of k that minimizes the Bostine distances between the two formations. Okay, so the process of hierarchical clustering is very simple. We find the two most similar formation observations as quantified by the Bostine distance and combine them to form a group. We find the next two most similar observations in our training sample and combine them. And eventually you begin to kind of combine groups and you build up a hierarchy. And of course you can plot this as a dendrogram. So the clustering indicates that essentially there are 5 groups of formations, and visual inspection indicates that within each of these groups there are typically around 4 variants. So this essentially produced a total of 20 unique formation types, or what I'll call formation clusters. So what I'm going to do now is just step through each of these groups and see what they look like. So looking at group 1, these are clusters 1 to 4. They make up 17% of the formation observations in the sample. As always, teams are attacking from right to left. And you can see that the common feature amongst all of these is that they're teams that play essentially with 5 defenders or 5 at the back. And then there are variants of in terms of the structure of the midfield and the forward line. So you could say that cluster 1 is a 5-4-1, cluster 2 is a 5-3-2, and so on. And these mostly consist of defensive formation observations. Group 2, so this is kind of switched now to more of to formations where they have 4 defenders, typically, with quite a condensed or narrow midfield. Again, these predominantly consist of defensive formation observations. In group 3 is another set of formations with 4 defenders, but much broader distribution across the midfield. So you can see in cluster 12 on the right is your sort of standard 4-4-2. Cluster 11 would be a 4-1-4-1. Clusters 9 and 10 are variants of a 4-3-3, although you could interpret these. Some people might refer to these as being a midfield diamond. And these are still, again, majority consist of defensive formations with the exception of cluster 10. Now, group 4 is almost entirely consists of offensive formations. You can kind of see why. They now have essentially 3 defenders with the 2 outside defenders or wingbacks pushed up into midfield, and variations in the structures of the midfield and forward line. And group 5 you could call almost 2 defenders at the back. Again, the outside defenders here have pushed up into midfield, and we have variations again in the structure of the forward line, particularly either 3 or 2, 3 or 4 forwards. And these are almost entirely made up of offensive formation observations. So here's the full set of 20 unique formation clusters. And so one of the things to point out here is that the hierarchical clustering is very efficient at separating offensive and defensive formation observations, even though the compactness or how compact the formations are cannot be used as a discriminator because of our scaling factor. Another thing to note here is that whilst you can sort of find formations that were easily recognizable and describable in terms of the sort of number of defenders, number of fielders, number of forwards, the data indicates that there are much more complex formations in there that are not quite so easily described and that we don't typically refer to when we describe the formations that teams are using in a match. So essentially, it's indicating that the more nuance in team strategy and team formation. So now that we've identified 20 unique formation clusters from formation observations of the training set, what we can do is use these as a basis set for which to classify any new formation observations. And we've developed a Bayesian model selection algorithm that essentially calculates the probability that any given formation observation is drawn from each of that set of 20. And so this now classification enables us to create tactical summaries of matches, and I'll present these in the next few slides, as well as detecting, in a statistical sense, changes in formation. So what we do is apply this methodology, the classification scheme, to a larger sample of 300 matches, nearly 10,000 formation observations, and study some of the results. So one of the first things we can look at is the relationship between offensive and defensive formations and how teams tend to pair them. So what you're looking at here is a Sankey chart that indicates the most frequent pairings of defensive and offensive formation observations in our data set. The numbers on the left indicate the defensive formation cluster number, and the numbers on the right show the offensive formation cluster number, and the width of the line indicates how frequently they were paired in our sample. So let's again look at a couple of examples. Teams that play with formation cluster 2, which we could describe here as a 5-3-2, almost exclusively transition to formation cluster 16 when they gain possession of the ball. So again, on the left-hand side, it's when they're defending. On the right-hand side, they're in possession and they're attacking. And you can see, what the story would be here. The two outside defenders would push up into midfield. The two midfielders in the outside midfielders in the central three would tuck in behind the two forwards, and the holding defensive midfielder would largely stay put. However, if we look at teams that defend with cluster 9, which we could call a 4-3-3 or perhaps a 4-4-2 with a midfield diamond, they differ in terms of their offensive configuration. Some teams transition to offensive cluster 10, where the two outside forwards push wide. Others transition to offensive cluster 18, where it's the two defenders who provide the width, and the front three players remain fairly narrow. And you could say this is somewhat similar to how a team like Liverpool may play sometimes. So there are really kind of two conclusions from this bit. First of all, it provides a validation of the methodology because it's clear how players would transition between their defensive and offensive roles. There's a clear story. It makes sense. That, of course, isn't the case by construction. And it's also, the other take-home point here is that some formations appear to provide more flexibility in attacking options, how teams transition to their offensive stance than others do. Okay, so our methodology allows us to make rolling observations of team formations throughout a match and then classify them according to this unique set. And therefore, it allows us to detect significant tactical changes in the matches in an automated fashion. And so here's one such example. This is what I like to call a strategic match summary. The chart depicts a tactical summary of the match between the red team and the blue team. So the x-axis shows match time from 0 to 95 minutes, and the y-axis shows the formation cluster number. And so each point is essentially a formation observation. Circles indicate formation observations of teams when they're in possession of the ball, and diamonds indicate formation observations when teams were defending or out of possession of the ball. So for each team, there's a defensive formation and an offensive formation. So for example, you can see that the blue team defended throughout the entire match with defensive formation 12, which is in this case a 4-4-2. So the story of this game is that, I should say that along the top of the plot, you can see when the goal timings, and on the bottom, you can see the timings of the substitutions. So the story of this game is the red team go a goal down quite early on, and at halftime they make a significant tactical change, switching essentially from a 5-man defense, or you could perhaps call it a 3-4-3, an offensive variant, to what we typically refer to as a 4-3-3, and an offensive variant. And at the same time, they also made a substitution, and this is a common theme that we see throughout major formation changes, that they're frequently accompanied by substitution as well. They pulled a goal back shortly after halftime, but eventually lost the game 2-1. And so we can use this kind of analysis, automated detection of formation changes, to start to study the mannerisms or the preferences of managers and how they react to certain situations, the tactical changes they might like to make. And the red team in this case are kind of interesting because they frequently made significant tactical changes at halftime in approximately about a quarter of the games of their games in our data sample. So let's look at another example. So what I'm plotting here is the defensive formation measured from the red team, same red team as in the previous slide. In the first half, here they're attacking from right to left. And on the left-hand plot, I am plotting a pass and shot map of their opponents in a subsequent match. It's not the same blue team as in the previous slide, and this team was one of the best teams in the league. And so what you see is like a whole sequence of arrows. Each arrow indicates a pass in the first half, and the dots indicate shots, and the size of the dots indicates the quality of the shooting opportunity. And so what you can see is that the blue team predominantly would attack down the flanks, particularly down the right-hand side. And in fact, they made the vast majority of the high-quality opportunities from crosses from the right-hand side of the field. And very little went through the center of the field, quite possibly because of the three central midfielders deployed by the red team defensively. At halftime, the red team made a significant tactical change, essentially switching to 5 at the back, 2 midfielders, and then 3 forwards. And you can see that the pass and shot map of the blue team changed significantly in the second half as well. There's far less coming down the right flank. The number of high quality opportunities reduced, and they tended to play in the second half passes more through the center of the field. And again, this is possibly because they were now the center of the field was less claustrophobic. They were facing fewer midfielders in the second half than they were in the first. And so clearly this type of analysis can be used to begin to anticipate how a manager may react to specific situations, game state situations, and how that might affect the outcome of the match. And in this case, the red team were actually significantly more effective at preventing high quality scoring opportunities in the second half after their formation change. So this is now my sort of final results or analysis slide. And I wanted to show you a new piece of analysis that we've been working on in the last couple of months to study the relationship between chance creation and defensive formation disruption. So if we know a team's preferred defensive structure, then we can measure how different the players' positions are to that structure at any given instant of time, or what I like to refer to as formation disruption. We can also quantify the level of threat to their goal using pitch control models, such as those developed by people like Will Spearman at Liverpool and Javi Fernandez at Barcelona, to measure how much territory the attacking team controls near their opponent's goal. So what I'm going to do now is show you a 25-second clip of the blue team attacking the red team. The right-hand panel is going to show you a time series of the degree of formation disruption in blue, so how disruptive the blue team's defensive formation is, and the degree of attacking threat from the red team in red. And on the left-hand side, you see what I call the tactical view, and here that indicates the formation of the third formation of the blue team, at least the 2 defensive lines and the 2 forwards, and where the individual lines connect the players to show how far the players. So I'll play that forward. In particular, watch how the sort of left central midfielder of the blue team eventually gets pulled out of position that allows the red team to create a sort of a threat. One of the nice things about pitch control models is that you can identify threatening situations even when there wasn't necessarily. Okay, so that's my final slide. So what I've done, to do a quick summary of what I presented, methods for measuring and classifying key information using tracking data, identifying the sets of information used for large training sample. We looked at methods for dynamic detection of formation changes, events of a short set of results on the impact of outcomes. So transitions between defensive formations is something we're doing a lot more of now, and as well as looked at initial work linking the disruption of the defensive shape to chance creation. There's a lot of things we're beginning to do with this. This is really kind of the first step in a lot more projects, a large number of projects. We have, we're particularly interested in being looking at more discrete phases of the game. So what is the team structure when a team is defending with a high press versus a low block? What is the difference between in a team structure when they are consolidating possession compared to when they're actually attempting to create a chance? We're very interested in the speed of transition that teams are able to execute when they lose the ball. So how quickly are they able to regain defensive shape after they lose possession? This is something we've done a lot of work on recently. And we're also doing a lot of work to apply a sort of similar analogous methodology to understand how teams approach set pieces. And so with that, I'll just say thank you all for logging in and listening.
Thanks, Laurie. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone has questions for Laurie. If Laurie, you can stick around.
Yeah.
Going once.
Hey, Laurie.
Hi.
Hey, this is Adam Vonderhaar. I was curious when you did the clustering, how did you arrive at some threshold to cut off that, there were 20 distinct clusters? Obviously, that cluster keep going further down and down. How did you arrive at just kind of where you should cut that off?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, to be honest, ideally, you want to have a kind of quantified threshold in terms of the, this velocity distance in how we select clusters. In practice, there's a lot of visual inspection to try to make sure that we weren't necessarily missing out potential, different other unique formations, or accidentally merging together two things that were considerably different. So I'd say it was there was an initial cut in terms of the metric for us quantifying similarity formations, but some degree of visual inspection around that threshold. It's not a hard and fast threshold.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions for Laurie? All right. Well, thanks so much, Laurie, for joining. Sounds like you will be at the conference, so hopefully people can come see you in person there too.
Yeah, certainly. I'd love to chat. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Awesome presentation.